Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Takeaways podcast, where we discuss the latest in technology in the Southern Africa region. On today's episode, we are going to focus on Starlink's entrance into South Africa and how that's going at the moment. So, before we dive into what's happening at the moment, I think it's important that we paint a broader picture of how exactly we got to where we are at the moment. Starlink has been trying to get a license to operate in South Africa. The reasons are pretty straightforward. To start with, it's the country with one of the biggest economies in Africa. So if you're trying to scale your product in Africa, you kind of are going to look at, trying to enter into South Africa. But there's been a holdup, and the holdup has not really been because of typical reasons why a technology company or a communications company cannot be able to get like a license in a market, which are usually, spectrum issues or like other technical issues. The core of the matter, or the crux of the matter, is the ownership structure that Starlink would have to assume for it to be able to get the license to be able to operate in South Africa. So in South Africa, the telecoms licensing rules require that 30% of a license holder's equity be owned by historically disadvantaged groups. Now, to start with, most people think that it means Starlink has to give away this equity. That's not really how it works. They have to sell it to like a group, or be it a trust, or any other structure. But they don't just give it away for free, right? So that's the requirements in South Africa. But the issue is that SpaceX, which is the Starlink's parent company, has a global policy where it does not sell any equity in any of the subsidiaries that they have in a particular country. So that's what created standoff. To be able to get a license to do business in South Africa, you need to assign a particular amount of the equity to HDPs, but Starlink has a policy also to not do that. In order for Starlink to be able to get a license, they had two options really. Either you decide to abide by the rules of the country, two, you decide to find a way to not have to give away the equity, not have to sell the equity, or three, you just decide to not get into the market. So that's the big picture. That's how we got to where we are at the moment. On Friday, Solima Latsi, who is the Minister of Digital Communications and Technologies in South Africa, issued a policy directive to ICASA. To sum it up, he basically required ICASA to align the licensing requirements which they have there as a regulator to align with the broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act regulations, which of course have a provision for what's called the equity equivalent investment programs. The question now becomes, what exactly are equity equivalent investment programs? They are programs which already exist as part of the BBBE Act, and what they do is that they allow foreign companies, instead of having to give away the 30% equity, what they can instead do is that they invest in skills development, infrastructure, or any other programs that also align with trying to improve the lives of South Africans, right? But for the EEIPs basically be allowed, this has to be written off by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And it's a common thing, in South Africa, right? Amazon, your Google, and JP Morgans have taken advantage of that. Now, what the minister here is trying to say is that ICASA's requirement for the foreign companies to give away the equity as part of the licensing requirements is not aligned to the national policy, which is guided by the BBBE Act, of course. So that's the issue. And so by issuing the directive, the minister is effectively trying to force ICASA to amend the current structure that they have as a regulator to then, align with, like a national policy which incorporates EEIPs. The other layer that complicates this whole issue is that it has went beyond just Starlink does not want to give away the equity, and the government of South Africa should not bend his back to like allow Starlink to come into South Africa. The other issue is that it has become a political issue. And the reason for this is that SpaceX is owned by Elon Musk. And Elon Musk has been a huge proponent of this whole thing of that there's a white genocide that's going on in South Africa. And through him retweeting stuff about this genocide, it got to a point where President Trump got a hold of it, and I think he imposed some tariffs on South Africa, and then President Ramaphosa had to travel to the US to explain that there was no genocide that's going on in South Africa. So why it's a political issue is that you have the owner of SpaceX, which owns Starlink, being involved in the politics of South Africa and doing what people in South Africa say, peddling of lies, etc., etc. It's a political issue now because you have these political parties who are saying now that like Starlink should never operate in South Africa, not because of the whole equity and ownership structure issue, but because it's owned by a person who harbors such opinions about the country. So I think that's what like extremely complicates it in that matter, because if it becomes a political issue, then it's going to become pretty much a stalemate. Because if you look at what's probably going to happen next, if the policy directive by the minister goes through the legal and political scrutiny, etc., and Starlink gets to a point where they can be able to submit an equity equivalent proposal, then you will still have the political issue where the opposition is saying you have a government which is willing to harbor a company that's owned by a person who is peddling lies about country. That complicates it a lot, and it reminds me of how Starlink got a license to operate in Botswana. What had happened was that Starlink had long applied for a license, but I think their application stalled for a year. And then President then traveled to the US, right? He met the executives of SpaceX, and through some closed door meetings, etc., the president came back home, and then he instructed the regulator to fast track the application of Starlink. And then Starlink was licensed a few months after that, right? So it went beyond just the regulatory issue. I think the issue is obviously it's really complex because you have the regulator who do not agree with the minister, and then you have the minister whose party is obviously a part of the GNU, and in the GNU you have the ANC, which does not agree with the minister. So it gets really, really complex. And then beyond just the GNU itself, you have other parties like in the political spectrum, which obviously are going to use the issue for political conversation that they want to have. So it's going to be really interesting to have a look at, and I'll be keeping my eye and ears on it. So I'll be on the lookout for how the issue is going to develop on the newsletter. I look forward to engaging more with you guys there. So that's it for this episode, which is the very first episode of the Takeaways podcast. I really appreciate you guys tuning in, and I look forward to being able to share more of this content with you guys as time goes on. Really appreciate you guys a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.